The siren
That
wasn't an
baby is not
ambulance. It was
yours.
a gang of black SUVs tearing up my driveway. The garden gate exploded. My baby shower, my dream of a perfect, peaceful life, shattered in a heartbeat. Men in suits, guns drawn. I was 7 months pregnant and trapped in a war zone. Then the man who was in charge walked toward me, a stranger, a terrifying, cold-eyed stranger who looked like he owned the air I was breathing. He didn't ask a question. He delivered a sentence. That child is mine. You carry my blood. How? I'd never met him. This was an IVF miracle baby with my husband Daniel. But the truth, confirmed by a rushed paternity test, was a betrayal I couldn't comprehend. My fertility clinic had swapped the genetic material. This man, Ricardo De Luca, a Mafia boss, was my baby's father, and now his rivals wanted us dead. Hey friends, before we start, don't forget to subscribe, like this video, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The soft, golden light of the early afternoon streamed through the tall windows, casting a warm glow over the pastel-colored decorations that filled the garden. Isabella Carter sat at the center of it all, 7 months pregnant, her hands cradling the roundness of her belly, feeling its steady rhythm beneath her skin. Surrounded by family and friends, she felt a wave of peace wash over her. After years of struggling with infertility and multiple rounds of IVF, she was finally here, carrying the baby she and her husband Daniel had longed for. A small smile tugged at the corners of her lips as she watched the guests chat and laugh, blissfully unaware of the storm that was about to descend. The table before her was piled high with pastel-wrapped presents, each one more thoughtfully picked out than the last. Isabella had never imagined a baby shower could feel so perfect, so filled with promise. Her mother and her best friend, Sarah, had worked tirelessly to make the day special, filling the venue with delicate baby blue and pink balloons, flower arrangements that smelled sweet and fresh, and a cake that looked like it had been plucked from the pages of a magazine. Everything was light, airy, and soft, the very essence of new beginnings. Isabella let out a deep breath, her hand brushing her swollen belly once more. This was the life she'd dreamed of. She had a loving husband, a beautiful home, and now a child on the way. It had taken years to get to this point, but here she was, finally able to hold her miracle baby in her arms. She could hear the laughter of her guests drifting through the air, mingling with the gentle hum of summer insects outside. The sun was high, the breeze mild, and for the first time in a long time, Isabella felt like she could finally relax. Her gaze flicked over to Daniel, who stood near the gift table chatting with some of his colleagues. He looked the part, handsome in his tailored suit, his blonde hair combed to perfection. He was every bit the successful, conventional man she had married. The perfect life, she thought, almost sighing with contentment. But beneath the picture-perfect surface, something had always felt missing. There was a lack of passion in their marriage, something she had noticed long before they had even decided to try for children. Daniel was a good man, reliable, stable, safe, but there had always been an absence of spark. Still, he was the man she had chosen, and Isabella had long convinced herself that she could be happy with him. As the afternoon wore on, Isabella opened gift after gift, each one more thoughtful than the last. A hand-knitted baby blanket from her mother, soft and colorful, a tiny stuffed bear from Sarah, who had been her closest friend since childhood. Isabella's heart swelled with gratitude. She looked out at the sea of smiling faces, feeling the weight of her good fortune. Her fingers brushed the soft fabric of the blanket, the intricate stitching still fresh with the scent of lavender. She looked up at Sarah, who was beaming beside her, and smiled back, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "This is perfect," Isabella murmured, her voice thick with emotion. Sarah squeezed her hand and leaned in, whispering, "You deserve this, Isabella. You've waited so long." Isabella nodded, her eyes flickering back to the gifts, the cake, the joyful chatter. This is everything I've wanted, she thought. This is my life now. But as she reached for another gift, her world was violently pulled from its axis. The deep rumble of engines echoed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. The ground beneath them seemed to tremble as the roar of black SUVs tore through the peaceful atmosphere. Isabella froze, her hand still hovering over the next gift, the smile on her face fading into confusion. She turned to Sarah, who looked equally bewildered. Before either of them could speak, the garden gate crashed open with a deafening crack. Isabella's heart skipped a beat. Guests shrieked, scattering in every direction as men dressed in dark suits poured out of the vehicles, their movements precise, their eyes scanning the crowd. Panic rose like a tidal wave, the garden descending into chaos. Isabella's hand instinctively went to her belly, her body tensing, unsure of what was happening. She felt Daniel's presence beside her, his hand reaching out to steady her, but his usual calm demeanor was replaced with visible panic. "Stay close," he murmured, his voice tight. But Isabella could barely hear him over the sounds of frightened footsteps and shouting guests. Her pulse hammered in her ears as the men began forming a circle around them, cutting off any chance of escape. They were too calm, too coordinated, their guns barely visible but unmistakable in their holsters. Then, from the center of the chaos, one man emerged, standing tall and unfazed by the panic swirling around him. He moved toward them with the kind of confidence that turned heads and sent shivers down spines. His black hair was cut short, and his dark eyes locked on Isabella with a terrifying intensity. He was dressed in a charcoal suit that looked far too expensive for any casual gathering, and every inch of him exuded a dangerous kind of control. As he approached, the crowd seemed to part for him, as though they could sense the menace radiating from his every step. He stopped just a few feet away from Isabella and Daniel, his gaze never leaving her. Isabella's breath caught in her throat, her instincts screaming at her to move, to run, but her feet felt frozen to the ground. The stranger's eyes flicked briefly to Daniel before returning to Isabella, his expression unreadable. He exhaled a slow breath, his voice a deep rumble that cut through the chaos. "That child is mine," he said, his words deliberate and chilling. Isabella blinked in confusion, her mind struggling to process what he had just said. She shook her head, stepping back instinctively. I don't know you," she stammered, her voice trembling. Daniel moved in front of her protectively, his hand raised. "What the hell is this? Who are you?" His voice was firm, but his eyes darted nervously, unsure of how to handle the situation. The man, Riccardo De Luca, did not flinch, his expression unwavering. "You don't know me, Isabella," he said, his voice laced with a calm certainty that sent a chill down her spine. "But your baby is mine. You carry my blood." Isabella's stomach turned. "My baby?" The words barely made sense in her mind. This man was a stranger to her, someone she had never seen before in her life. How could he claim her child? The world around her seemed to blur, her thoughts racing, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "I don't understand," Isabella whispered, her heart pounding. She turned to Daniel, hoping for some reassurance, but the look in his eyes was pure fear, a fear that mirrored her own. "Don't listen to him, Isabella," Daniel said, his voice shaking. "He's lying. This is all a sick joke." But Riccardo wasn't finished. He reached inside his jacket and pulled out an envelope, which he extended toward Isabella. Two of his men stepped forward, ensuring there was no threat. He slid the envelope into her hands, his gaze never wavering. "This," he said calmly, "is proof. Your procedure was compromised." Isabella's eyes flicked to Daniel, who still stood in front of her, his arms outstretched, trying to shield her. "You don't have to believe me, but you need to believe one thing. You and your child are in danger now. The Morettis want him." Before Isabella could process his words, the gravity of the situation hit her like a cold wave. She stared at the envelope, her hands trembling. What is happening? And just like that, her world was no longer the peaceful, loving place it had been moments ago. The sterile white walls of the hospital room felt like a prison, as Isabella sat on the edge of the bed, her fingers clutching the envelope Ricardo had handed her earlier. The room was still, too quiet. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, doing little to distract her from the storm raging inside her mind. Every movement felt heavy, like she was walking through thick fog, unable to see where she was headed. The paternity test results, an undeniable confirmation that Ricardo De Luca was the biological father of her child, lay in her hands, the ink still fresh on the page. She had been forced to submit to the test in the midst of the chaos, the sting of Ricardo's words still echoing in her ears. That child is mine. The moment the doctor had read the test results aloud, her world had tilted, and now all that was left was the wreckage. She stared down at the paper, the stark black text spelling out the impossibility of it all. 99.9% certainty. Ricardo wasn't just some random stranger who had stumbled into her life. No, he was the biological father of the child she had carried for 7 months. The child she had dreamed of sharing with Daniel, her husband. Daniel. Her heart sank as she turned her gaze toward the window, where the first signs of dusk were beginning to creep across the sky. The soft glow of the streetlights outside reflected the hollowness she now felt inside. How could this be happening? How had her life spiraled into this whirlwind of lies and secrets? Isabella had always prided herself on having a sense of control, on keeping her life in balance. The baby she was carrying had been her miracle, a gift after years of failed attempts and heartbreak. But now that miracle had been twisted into something unrecognizable, something she couldn't understand. Her thoughts drifted back to the IVF treatment, the one she had undergone at Riverside Reproductive Center. It had seemed so straightforward at the time, an answer to her prayers. After all the failed cycles, all the endless tests and procedures, she had finally been given the green light for IVF. She had been thrilled when they discovered her embryo was healthy, a perfect match for implantation. But as it turned out, that match hadn't come from Daniel, the man she had married. It had come from Ricardo De Luca. How could this happen? The question lingered in her mind like an open wound, and as the pieces of the puzzle slowly clicked into place, Isabella began to understand the full extent of the betrayal. The fertility clinic wasn't the safe, professional place it had seemed to be. No, the Moretti family, rivals to Ricardo, had orchestrated everything from the start. Dr. Marcus Santoro, the clinic's leading physician, had been on the Moretti's payroll for years. He was the one who had swapped Daniel's genetic material with Ricardo's, all as part of a larger plan to create a biological heir to De Luca's empire, a child that the Morettis could control. Isabella's pregnancy was never a coincidence. It had been carefully orchestrated by enemies far more powerful than she could have ever imagined. Her mind reeled as the realization hit her like a physical blow. The Morettis hadn't just used her as a pawn, they had used her child. Her baby was now a weapon in a war she hadn't known existed. She had been carrying Ricardo's child all along. It was his blood that ran through the tiny veins inside her, his DNA that formed every inch of her baby's being. The questions kept piling up, each one more difficult to face than the last. How had this been allowed to happen? Why had the Morettis chosen her? And how could she ever trust Daniel again, knowing that he had received anonymous warnings about the baby not being his? How could he ignore them? How could he be so blind to the truth? She had wanted to believe in their perfect life, in the picture of a happy family they were supposed to build. But now that image had shattered, leaving only fragments of a relationship that no longer felt real. Isabella's heart clenched with guilt as the thought of Daniel's face crossed her mind. She had known him for years, had married him with the hope of building a life full of love and stability. But now she wondered if that life had ever been truly hers, or if it had been nothing more than a fragile illusion. The man she had married was now the man who had abandoned her when things got too complicated, the man who had turned his back on her in the face of a brutal truth. The phone on the bedside table buzzed, snapping Isabella out of her thoughts. She picked it up hesitantly, her fingers shaking as she glanced at the caller ID. Daniel. Her breath hitched in her chest, the tension in her muscles unmistakable. She knew this conversation was coming, but she wasn't ready. She had no idea what to say to him. Was there even anything left to say? With a shaky sigh, she answered the call. Daniel. Her voice cracked, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. See, he said, his voice low and strained. I'm so sorry. I don't know what to say. The silence between them felt heavy, oppressive, as if the weight of their broken marriage hung in the air like a storm cloud. Isabella could hear his breathing on the other end of the line, each inhale and exhale filled with regret and guilt. I didn't know what to believe, he continued, his words faltering. When I got those messages, when they told me the baby wasn't mine, I thought it was some sick joke. But now I see what's happened. I see what you've been through, and I can't handle this. Isabella squeezed her eyes shut, the tears she had been holding back now threatening to spill over. So what, Daniel? Her voice was barely a whisper, a tremble in the words. You just give up on me, on us, you turn your back on our child because things got too complicated? I never wanted this, Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion. I didn't want to hurt you. But I can't be the father of another man's child. I can't raise a baby that doesn't belong to me. I don't know how to do that. Isabella felt a sharp pain in her chest as his words sank in. The man she had married, the man she had trusted with her heart, couldn't even accept the baby they had both longed for. He couldn't handle the truth, couldn't face the consequences of what had happened. And in that moment, Isabella realized that everything she had believed in, everything she had hoped for, had been a lie. I don't know what to say to you anymore, Daniel, she whispered, her voice broken. I don't know if I can ever forgive you for abandoning me like this. Izzy, please. His voice cracked, the pleading in his tone raw, but Isabella didn't want to hear it. She had heard enough. I have to go, she said softly, her heart aching with the finality of the words. Goodbye, Daniel. The line went dead, and Isabella was left in the silence of her hospital room, alone with the weight of everything that had changed. She had lost Daniel. She had lost the future they had dreamed of. And now she was left with Ricardo, this dangerous, mysterious man who had claimed her child as his own. As the evening light faded, Isabella was consumed with a mixture of anger, confusion, and despair. She didn't know what to feel anymore, but one thing was certain. Her life had been irreversibly altered. The man she thought she knew was gone, and in his place, Ricardo De Luca stood, a man she had no choice but to confront. Torn between her marriage and the man who now held the key to her child's future, Isabella couldn't help but wonder how far she was willing to go to protect her baby, and more importantly, how far Ricardo was willing to go for her. In that moment, the answers felt impossibly distant, buried beneath the chaos that now defined her life. The days that followed Daniel's departure felt like they were happening in a blur, each moment slipping into the next, with no clear distinction between them. Isabella spent most of her time in a fog, her mind constantly turning over the events that had shattered her life. Daniel, her husband, the man she had believed in, had left her alone in the face of a threat far greater than anything she had imagined. He hadn't been able to handle the truth that her child, the baby they had so desperately wanted, wasn't his. The truth that their entire life together had been built on a fragile foundation of lies. She had hoped, even in the midst of everything that had happened, that he might come around, that he would realize that love, real love, meant staying through the darkest moments, through the mess. But Daniel had done the opposite. He had abandoned her when she needed him the most, choosing to walk away rather than confront the reality of their situation. The divorce papers arrived in the morning mail. It was a blow, but in some ways, Isabella had expected it. She stared at the envelope for what felt like an eternity, the weight of the finality sinking deep into her chest. Daniel had made his choice, and now there was nothing left between them but legalities. She hadn't even been given a chance to fight for their marriage, for the life they had once dreamed of. In the end, he couldn't look past the child she carried, couldn't accept the fact that her baby wasn't his. Tears welled up in her eyes as she set the papers down on the kitchen counter. She hadn't cried in days, but now, in the quiet solitude of her home, she let the emotions come. Why had he left? Wasn't their love enough to survive something as small as a genetic mistake? Wasn't their family worth fighting for? But she knew the answer. He hadn't loved her enough. He hadn't loved her enough to stand by her when the truth had come to light. The child they had wanted for so long, the miracle she had carried in her womb for 7 months, had torn them apart. As her tears fell silently onto the table, Isabella felt something inside of her harden. She couldn't cry for him anymore. Daniel had chosen to walk away, and she couldn't keep clinging to a man who had so easily discarded her. The thought of the life they could have had together, of raising their child in a loving home, now seemed like a distant dream. The life she had wanted had never truly been hers to begin with. Daniel's love had been conditional, fragile, and when it was tested, it had shattered. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. She wiped her eyes quickly, hoping it wasn't someone from the law office, come to discuss the divorce. But when she opened the door, she found herself face to face with someone she hadn't expected, someone she hadn't wanted to see. Ricardo De Luca stood on her doorstep, his dark eyes scanning her face with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. His presence was like a shadow that stretched across her life, darkening everything in its path. He was as imposing as ever, dressed in a tailored suit that clung to his frame in a way that reminded Isabella just how dangerous he was. But there was something else in his eyes now, something softer than she had ever seen before. "Isabella," Ricardo said, his voice low, almost tender. "Can we talk?" She hesitated for a moment before stepping aside, allowing him to enter. She hadn't invited him in, but at this point, she didn't know what else to do. She didn't know who else to turn to. Ricardo, for all his ruthlessness, had promised to protect her, even if his protection came with strings attached. Ricardo walked into the living room, his sharp gaze taking in every detail of her home, though he didn't speak. He seemed different now, his usual air of menace replaced by something unreadable. He was no longer the cold Mafia boss who had barged into her life with threats and force. Now there was something more behind his eyes, something that hinted at vulnerability, a glimpse of something human buried beneath the surface of his calculated demeanor. "I assume you've read the papers," Ricardo said, finally breaking the silence. Isabella nodded, the divorce papers still fresh in her mind. "He left," she whispered. "He couldn't handle it." Ricardo didn't respond immediately. Instead, he moved to the window and stared out at the garden, his back to her. He seemed deep in thought, as if weighing his next words carefully. Isabella was struck by the stillness in himself, the way he seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. "I never meant for you to go through this," he said, his voice barely audible. "I never wanted you to be caught in the crossfire of this war." He turned to face her, his dark eyes filled with something more than the cold indifference she had seen before. "But I can protect you. I can keep you safe from the Morettis." Isabella felt a wave of uncertainty wash over her. Ricardo De Luca was dangerous, a man whose world was built on violence and crime, yet somehow, in the chaos of the last few days, he had become her only ally. She didn't trust him, but the thought of being alone, of facing the Morettis without anyone to protect her, was too terrifying to ignore. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. You've got what you wanted. The baby is yours. Why keep me safe? What's in it for you? Ricardo's lips twitched into a small, rueful smile. You think I want to use you? He asked, his voice laced with bitterness. Maybe at first, but now I'm doing this because I owe it to you and to the child. He took a step toward her, his gaze never leaving her face. And because I can't let you be destroyed by the people who tried to use you as a pawn. His words hung in the air between them, thick with tension. Isabella felt a flicker of something inside her, something that made her want to believe him, even though she knew she shouldn't. He's a mafia boss. He's not the hero in this story. But as she looked at him, at the man who had become so entangled in her life, she realized that she had no choice. Daniel was gone. She had nothing left to cling to except her unborn child and the man standing in front of her. Ricardo had offered her protection, and though she didn't fully trust him, it was the only option she had left. Ricardo took another step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. I'll keep you safe, Isabella, but you need to understand something. His tone shifted, becoming harder. You owe me your loyalty. The Morettis won't stop until they have what they want, and you and your baby are their targets. If you're going to stay here under my protection, you'll have to accept that. Isabella felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She didn't want to owe this man anything, didn't want to be tied to him in any way. But the reality of her situation was inescapable. She was alone, and if she didn't accept his offer, the Morettis would come for her and for her baby. I'll stay, she said quietly, her voice laced with defeat, but only because I don't have a choice. Ricardo's gaze softened slightly, though the underlying tension in his posture remained. Then let's get you out of here. The Morettis will come for you soon. I can't protect you if you stay here, isolated. Isabella stood there, her mind spinning with the weight of the decision she had just made. She was agreeing to stay with a man she barely knew, a man who had claimed her child as his own, but it was the only option she had left. For her baby's sake, she would go wherever Ricardo told her to. I'll go with you, she said, her voice steady now, though her heart pounded in her chest. But I need you to promise me one thing, Ricardo. He raised an eyebrow, intrigued. What is it? That no matter what happens, you keep my baby safe, she said, her gaze unwavering. That's the only thing I care about now. Ricardo's expression softened just a fraction, and for a brief moment, Isabella saw a flicker of something more than the ruthless mafia boss. I swear it, he said quietly. And with that promise, Isabella's life took yet another turn down a path she never could have imagined. She wasn't just carrying Ricardo's child anymore. She was walking into a world of danger, a world that would demand everything from her if she was to survive. But for now, the only thing she could do was hold on tightly to the child she loved, and to the man who was her reluctant protector. The heavy silence between Isabella and Ricardo, as they drove through the darkening streets of the city, felt suffocating. The hum of the engine was the only sound breaking through the tension. Isabella's hands rested on her lap, her fingers lightly tracing the edges of the envelope Ricardo had given her earlier, still unopened. Her mind was a whirlwind of questions and doubt. She had agreed to stay with him, to trust him, but the enormity of what she had just committed to hadn't fully sunk in yet. She had always been the kind of woman who made decisions based on logic and reason, but now logic was a distant memory. Her marriage had fallen apart in the blink of an eye, her life upended by a secret she had never known existed. And now she was bound to this man, a mafia boss, a criminal who had made it clear that her child was the key to a war she had no part in. The car slowed as they neared the outskirts of the city. The familiar lights of her suburban home were replaced by the shadowy outlines of trees and fields. They were heading toward an area Isabella didn't recognize. She shifted uneasily in her seat, glancing at Ricardo, who sat with his hands resting on the steering wheel, his eyes fixed ahead, his expression unreadable. Ricardo seemed unaffected by the storm of emotions Isabella was struggling to keep in check. His face was as impassive as ever, his sharp jawline set in a line of determination. He had given her his word, protection for her and the baby, but Isabella knew that his promise came with conditions she wasn't yet ready to accept. As the car took another turn, heading up a long driveway lined with tall wrought-iron gates, Isabella's curiosity began to stir. The estate before her was massive, imposing, with stone walls that stretched high into the night sky, crowned by security cameras and floodlights. The air around them felt thick with danger, as though every corner of the property was guarded, watched. The car rolled to a stop in front of an enormous mansion. The windows were dark, but the towering structure seemed to loom over them, as if it had been built to withstand anything except perhaps a threat from within. Ricardo turned the engine off and met her gaze briefly before stepping out of the car. The soft click of his door shutting echoed in the night. Isabella hesitated, her hand on the door handle, her pulse quickening. Was this really where she was going to stay? She had no choice, really. The moment she had agreed to Ricardo's terms, she had been pulled into his world. But the cold reality of her situation was just beginning to hit her. Could she really trust him? With a deep breath, she followed Ricardo up the steps and into the house, her footsteps soft against the stone pathway. The door swung open as soon as they reached it, revealing a tall man in a black suit. He nodded curtly at Ricardo, then gave Isabella a brief glance before stepping aside to let them in. The interior of the mansion was grand, but it lacked the warmth she had always imagined in a home. The walls were lined with dark wood paneling, and antique furniture filled the rooms, but everything seemed too cold, too distant. There was no personal touch, no signs of life beyond the cold, efficient world of Ricardo's empire. The dim lighting cast long shadows across the marble floors, creating an eerie atmosphere that Isabella couldn't shake. As they walked through the house, Ricardo led her toward a staircase that wound upward into darkness. He didn't say much, but Isabella noticed the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes flicked to every door they passed, as though he was always alert, always watching. This was his world, Isabella thought. A world of shadows and secrets. A world that had once seemed distant, far removed from her own, but now it was her reality. Ricardo stopped in front of a door at the end of the hall, unlocking it with a key from his pocket. "This will be your room," he said, his voice soft but firm. He pushed the door open, revealing a spacious, tastefully decorated bedroom. The walls were a muted shade of blue, the bed large and inviting, covered in crisp white linens. There was a sitting area by the window with a view of the sprawling grounds outside, and a small desk with a few scattered papers. Isabella stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room. It was beautiful, but it felt wrong. Nothing about it felt personal, nothing about it felt like hers. She hesitated, her feet glued to the spot. Was this what her life had become? A gilded cage? She turned to Ricardo, who stood in the doorway, watching her with those dark, calculating eyes. "Thank you," she said quietly, though the words felt hollow in her mouth. "You don't have to thank me," he replied, his voice low. "This is your protection, whether you like it or not. The Morettis will come after you, and when they do, I will be ready." He stepped into the room, his presence filling the space like an invisible weight. Isabella turned toward the window, looking out at the vast property stretching before her. The mansion felt like a fortress, every inch designed to keep threats at bay. But the threat wasn't just outside the walls, it was inside too. The Morettis were coming, and Ricardo wasn't just offering her protection. He was dragging her deeper into a war she had never wanted to be a part of. She turned to face him, her voice steady despite the rising storm inside her. "What's your endgame, Ricardo?" she asked, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Why are you doing this? You said you'd protect me, but I need to know why." Ricardo studied her for a long moment before speaking, his gaze flickering with something she couldn't quite place. "My world is built on power, Isabella. I've spent my entire life fighting to keep what's mine. He took a step toward her, his movements deliberate. And now I'm fighting for you and for our child. Isabella's stomach twisted at his words. She had heard rumors about Ricardo's empire, rumors that spoke of ruthlessness, violence, and control. And yet here he was, speaking of something else entirely. Protection. Love? No, that wasn't possible. She had seen the man behind the Mafia boss, the man who didn't hesitate to make a promise he intended to keep, but there was still a part of her that couldn't fully trust him. Could a man like Ricardo really change? Could he protect her, or was she just another pawn in his game? Why me? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Why protect me when you don't even know me? Ricardo paused, his expression softening just slightly. I didn't want this life, Isabella. I never wanted to be a father, but when I found out about the baby, about you, it changed everything. I'm not prepared for what's coming, but I'll be damned if I let anyone take you or our child. The words hung in the air, thick with meaning. Isabella stared at him, her mind racing. Fatherhood. That was the thing Ricardo hadn't expected, the thing that was pulling him into this battle. I don't know if I can trust you, Ricardo, she said, her voice trembling despite her efforts to remain strong. But I have no choice. I don't have anyone else. Ricardo's gaze softened, the usual hardness in his eyes replaced by something she hadn't seen before, something almost human. You don't need to trust me, he said quietly. Just know that I will protect you. You have my word. Isabella swallowed, her heart pounding in her chest. Protection. It was all she had left. But for her child's sake she would have to accept it, no matter the cost. As the night fell, Isabella stood by the window, looking out at the vast estate beyond, the feeling of isolation creeping in. But somewhere deep inside, a quiet vow took root. She would protect her baby, no matter what. And if that meant walking deeper into Ricardo's world, then so be it. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled the air, as Isabella lay on the hospital bed, her breath shallow, her hands clutching the edges of the blanket. It was still early, just past 6 in the morning, but her body had betrayed her. The contractions had come on faster than expected, more painful and intense than anything she had experienced before. At 36 weeks pregnant, she had hoped for a few more weeks of rest, but her body had other plans. Ricardo was beside her, his tall frame tense as he stood by the window, scanning the parking lot below. His sharp eyes missed nothing. Every car, every person who passed by was noted and catalogued in his mind. Isabella, lying flat on the bed, watched him. His usually composed exterior had cracked in the face of her labor. He had never looked so unsettled, even in the midst of their chaos-filled life. It was as though he could sense the storm brewing beyond the hospital's walls. Isabella. Ricardo's voice was low, a quiet edge of concern beneath the usual command. We need to move fast. The Morettis will come for you. She closed her eyes, her hand instinctively resting on her stomach. Sophia, the baby. She couldn't let them take her daughter. She couldn't let Ricardo's enemies take anything from her. Not again. The thought of the Morettis, the family who had orchestrated everything from the beginning, using her pregnancy as leverage against Ricardo, sent a surge of anger through her. They had already tried to manipulate her life and her future, and now, as she prepared to give birth to their child, they would stop at nothing to take that child away. Her breath hitched as another contraction rippled through her body, stronger this time. Ricardo's sharp gaze flicked toward her, his eyes immediately narrowing with concern. He moved to her side, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. Stay with me, Isabella, he murmured. We're almost there. Just breathe. She nodded, trying to focus on his words, but her mind kept spiraling. The baby, the Morettis, the danger. The tension in the air seemed to pulse around her like a storm, and she knew, she could feel it, that this wasn't going to be a normal birth. Not with Ricardo De Luca's enemies on their heels. "Ricardo," Isabella whispered, her voice trembling. "What's going to happen?" He didn't immediately respond, instead watching the door to her room closely, his hand on the gun he kept hidden in his waistband. He didn't trust the hospital. He didn't trust anyone right now, not with her. "We're going to make sure you're safe," he said, his voice steady, but there was something more in his eyes, something that had been there since he first stepped into her life. Protectiveness, fear, a side of Ricardo that until now she hadn't seen fully. Before she could reply, the sound of tires screeching in the parking lot below pierced the air. Her heart skipped a beat. Ricardo froze, his head snapping toward the window. "They're here," he muttered, barely audible. "Get ready." Isabella's heart began to race. She couldn't deny it. The Morettis had finally come for her. Ricardo's warning, his constant vigilance, had been for a reason. As the first wave of gunfire echoed through the hospital's parking lot, Isabella's blood ran cold. She heard the screams from the outside, the sounds of chaos exploding in the distance. Ricardo's men had been placed in key positions throughout the hospital, but Isabella knew deep down that there was no way to fully prepare for this kind of attack. The Morettis weren't playing by any rules. They had come for her, for the baby, and they would do whatever it took to get her. "Stay here," Ricardo commanded. He was already moving toward the door, his body coiled with tension as he pulled his gun from its holster. "Don't move, I'll be back." He didn't wait for her response. As he exited the room, Isabella's anxiety flared. The walls felt like they were closing in, the beeping of the monitors growing louder and more frantic in her ears. Her hands gripped the sides of the bed as another contraction hit, stronger than the last. "Stay with me, baby," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "You have to stay with me." The minutes seemed to drag on forever, every second feeling like an eternity. Ricardo's men had started to respond, but the sounds of fighting outside her door grew louder, closer. Ricardo's voice was now mingled with others, the unmistakable sound of men shouting, weapons firing. Her heart raced in her chest as her body grew more tense, more exhausted with each passing minute. Isabella could hear the unmistakable sounds of footsteps outside her room, a hard knock on the door, and then the door swung open. It wasn't Ricardo who entered. Instead, 4 armed men stormed in, their faces masked, their eyes cold with intent. They were Moretti soldiers, no doubt sent to abduct her, to take her and the child she carried. "Move!" one of the men barked, pushing a nurse out of the way as he grabbed Isabella's arm. Isabella screamed, instinctively jerking away, but the man's grip tightened. The pain from the contraction was still sharp in her abdomen, but fear coursed through her more intensely than the physical pain. She had to protect her child. She had to. Just as the man began to drag her out of bed, the door slammed open with a crash. Ricardo burst into the room, gun raised, his face a mask of fury. The sound of gunfire erupted, filling the room as Ricardo's men stormed in behind him. "Get away from her!" Ricardo's voice was like a roar as he moved forward, his gun steady in his hands. The Moretti soldiers scattered in every direction, trying to take cover behind the bed, behind the chairs. But Ricardo was too fast, too accurate. In a matter of seconds, the hospital room had turned into a battlefield. Isabella watched, her heart pounding, as Ricardo moved with terrifying precision, taking out the Morettis one by one. His movements were fluid, controlled, as though this was his world, a world of violence, a world he knew all too well. But she couldn't focus on the battle around her. She was on the verge of giving birth, and the pain was becoming unbearable. Another contraction, sharp and fierce, forced her to bite back a scream. She pressed her hand to her stomach, trying to breathe through the pain. "Not now. Not like this." Ricardo's voice reached her through the chaos, his eyes snapping to her for a moment. "Isabella, breathe. We're getting you out of here." But the sounds of the battle outside the room were getting louder. The Morettis weren't giving up. They wanted her and the baby. With a final deadly shot, Ricardo took out the last of the Moretti soldiers in the room, his face set in a grim line. His eyes turned to Isabella, a flicker of relief crossing his face when he saw she was still with him. He moved to her side, his hands gentle but urgent, as he helped her sit up. "You're okay. We're leaving now. The baby is coming." Before she could respond, another explosion rocked the hospital, sending vibrations through the walls. The blast was so strong that it knocked Isabella off balance, but Ricardo caught her before she could fall. "Stay with me," he said firmly, helping her to her feet. His voice was filled with quiet authority, but she could see the raw edge of fear behind his eyes. Gunshots rang out in the distance, but Ricardo was already pulling her toward the exit, his men clearing the way. In the midst of the violence and the chaos, Isabella's world seemed to narrow down to one singular, desperate need: protect her child. As they made their way down the hall, Ricardo's men at the ready, the final battle outside the walls of the hospital raged on. The Morettis were closing in. But as Isabella's heart pounded in her chest, she realized, no matter what happened next, she was not going down without a fight. The moon hung high in the sky, casting an eerie light over the abandoned parking lot that stretched before them. Isabella felt the cold bite of the night air, the chill creeping beneath her jacket, but it was nothing compared to the fire that had started burning in her chest. Tonight, they would end it. She had no illusions about what she was getting herself into. Breaking into the Riverside Reproductive Center was dangerous, but she had already crossed a line when she agreed to partner with Ricardo De Luca. She had seen enough of the dark side of the world, his world, to understand what was at stake. Her life, her baby's life, the fragile future she had once dreamed of, was now irrevocably tied to Ricardo's fight with the Moretti family. Ricardo stood beside her, his tall frame cloaked in shadow, his face a mask of cold determination. He was calm, his eyes scanning the facility ahead of them, but Isabella could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hands flexed, ready for action. Tonight they weren't just playing defense. Tonight they were going on the offensive. "This is where it all started," Ricardo murmured, his voice low, as though the building itself might hear him. He stood just a few steps from her, the faint rustle of his jacket the only sound breaking the silence. "The Morettis manipulated your life here, Isabella. Your pregnancy, your future. It was all part of their game." Isabella nodded, the weight of his words sinking in. She had learned much about the Morettis since Ricardo had taken her under his protection. They had used her as a pawn in a twisted game of power, and they hadn't stopped there. The Riverside Reproductive Center wasn't just a place for IVF treatment. It had been a front for a much larger operation, one that had orchestrated a network of manipulated pregnancies, stolen genetic material, and blackmail. Tonight, they were going to expose it all. Ricardo motioned for Isabella to follow as he led the way toward the side entrance of the building. The moonlight made the windows gleam eerily, but the building was otherwise silent, its doors locked tight. Ricardo had prepared for this. He had men inside, people who were already taking down the security system, ensuring their entry would go unnoticed. For Isabella, this was an entirely new world, a world where power wasn't just wielded by politicians or CEOs, but by men like Ricardo, who could slip into a fortified facility like this one without leaving a trace. Isabella's heart pounded in her chest, but her hands remained steady. This was the world she had stepped into, whether she liked it or not. And tonight, she would play her part. She wasn't the same woman who had walked into Ricardo's life months ago, naive and uncertain. She had learned, she had adapted, and now she was ready. Ricardo pulled out a small, high-tech device and attached it to the security panel beside the door. A few moments later, the light blinked green and the door clicked open. "Let's move," he whispered, his voice sharp and controlled. They moved quickly through the halls of the Riverside facility, Ricardo leading the way with his gun raised, scanning the corridors for any sign of movement. Isabella followed closely behind, her senses on high alert. Every step she took felt like it was leading her deeper into enemy territory. They reached the back offices where Ricardo's men had already cleared the area. He signaled for her to follow him to the files. Isabella's breath quickened as they approached the small office that held the key to the Moretti family's twisted plot. Ricardo opened the door and they entered, their footsteps muffled on the thick carpet. The room was dimly lit, filled with filing cabinets and stacks of papers. It looked ordinary at first glance, just another medical facility. But Isabella knew better. "This is where it all started," Ricardo said again, his voice colder now. "Dr. Santoro, he's the one who made sure you ended up carrying my child instead of Daniel's." Isabella's stomach turned. Dr. Marcus Santoro, the fertility specialist who had performed her IVF, was a man who had betrayed her trust in the most profound way possible. He had worked for the Morettis, using his position to manipulate women's pregnancies, swapping genetic material for their own malicious ends. They began sifting through the files. Isabella moved quickly, her hands trembling as she flipped through the paperwork, her eyes scanning for anything that would prove what she already suspected. This wasn't just a case of mistaken identity, it was a deliberate conspiracy. The Morettis had been orchestrating the creation of biological heirs for their own benefit, and they had chosen Isabella as a part of that plan. "Here," Ricardo said, pulling a thick folder from one of the drawers. The label on the file read, "Genetic Samples, Asset Creation." Isabella felt a cold shiver run down her spine as he opened it, revealing a set of charts, medical records, and genetic tests. Each name on the list was connected to a pregnancy. Each one, like hers, a calculated move in the Moretti's game. "This is bigger than we thought," Ricardo muttered under his breath. "More women, more assets. This isn't just about you, Isabella. The Morettis have been doing this for years." Isabella's mind raced as she scanned the files. The Morettis hadn't just manipulated her pregnancy. They had used dozens of women, creating children who were to be used as pawns in their criminal empire. The Morettis didn't just want power, they wanted control over the lives of those who didn't even know they were being manipulated. "They were creating heirs," Isabella whispered, her voice hoarse. "Moretti's heirs. He was using the clinic to build an army." Ricardo nodded, his face hardening. "This is bigger than anything I expected, and it's time to take it down." Isabella's mind was reeling. For the first time, she truly understood the depth of the Moretti's reach, the innocent lives they had destroyed, the power they had manipulated, and the lives they had stolen. Her child, her Sophia, was just one of many in this twisted game. She had to stop them. She had to make sure no other woman would fall victim to the same fate she had. But it wasn't just the women she was concerned about now. It was the lives of her child and Ricardo's empire, and if she was going to make a difference, she would have to take charge. "Ricardo," she said, her voice firm, "we need to end this, now." He looked up at her, his eyes narrowing as if sizing her up. "What do you mean?" "I mean we take this to the authorities," she said, her gaze never wavering. "The files are here. The evidence is clear. We expose the Morettis for what they are." Ricardo hesitated, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. Isabella saw it, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. He was a man of action, and her words had sparked something inside him. "You're right," he said, after a moment, his voice low and resolute. "We can't let them keep controlling everything from the shadows. We'll take this to the police, but we need to be careful. The Morettis won't go down without a fight." "Then we fight," Isabella replied. "We finish what we started." The tension in Ricardo's shoulders eased slightly, and for the first time, Isabella saw him as more than just a mafia boss. She saw him as someone who wanted to protect the life they had created together, someone who had been forced into this world but was willing to fight for what mattered. For her, for Sophia. Isabella straightened, feeling a sense of clarity wash over her. She wasn't just going to sit back and wait anymore. She had a voice in this. She had a purpose. I'll handle the next step, Ricardo said, his tone no longer uncertain. You get the files ready. We're going to bring them down. And in that moment, Isabella made a vow to herself. No matter the cost, no matter the consequences, she would protect her child and help Ricardo dismantle the Moretti empire. The knock on the door was tentative, almost hesitant, as if the person on the other side wasn't sure they should be there. Isabella froze, her heart skipping a beat. She hadn't expected to hear that sound again, not after everything that had happened. It had been weeks since Daniel had left her, weeks since he'd filed for divorce without warning, without looking back. And now, here he was, standing at her door like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Ricardo, ever watchful, was by her side in an instant, his presence a comforting weight. His sharp eyes flicked to Isabella's face, reading her emotions in an instant. He knew what this moment meant. This wasn't just a visit, this was a reckoning. The man she had married, the man she had trusted above all others, was back, and he had one final chance to make things right, or perhaps to make everything worse. Isabella exhaled slowly, her hand trembling as she reached for the door. She didn't want to face him, didn't want to relive the past. But the truth of their broken marriage had already been laid bare, and this was the only way forward. With a final glance at Ricardo, she turned the handle and opened the door. Daniel stood there, his hands shoved into his jacket pockets, his expression unreadable. He looked older somehow, tired, worn down by whatever battle he had been fighting inside himself. His once immaculate suit was slightly rumpled, and there was a new distance in his eyes that Isabella hadn't seen before. He wasn't the man she had married, the man she had built her life with. This man, this stranger, was nothing like the husband she had once known. "Izzy," Daniel said, his voice tentative, almost as if he wasn't sure how to address her anymore. "Can we talk?" Isabella didn't say anything at first, her eyes scanning his face, searching for some hint of the man she had once loved. There was nothing there, just a hollow emptiness that made her chest tighten. She opened the door wider, stepping aside to let him in. Daniel stepped into the foyer, but he didn't move farther into the house, as if he was afraid of what might happen if he did. He glanced around, his gaze landing on Ricardo, who stood in the background, his arms crossed, his presence commanding the room. "Ricardo," Daniel said, nodding curtly, "I guess this is where you've been hiding her." Isabella flinched at his words, at the accusatory tone in his voice. She had never imagined Daniel could speak to Ricardo like that, not after everything they had been through, not after all the lies had been exposed. But now it was clear, the past few weeks, the breakdown of their marriage, it had all been leading to this moment. A confrontation, a final reckoning. "Don't start with me, Daniel," Ricardo said, his voice low but firm. "You've made your choices. I'm here to make sure Isabella and the baby are safe." Daniel's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing at Ricardo. "Safe? That's your excuse? You've turned my life upside down, and now you're claiming to protect my wife and child." His voice rose slightly, frustration creeping in. "You've kidnapped her, Ricardo. That's what you've done. You've taken her from me, and now you're pretending like you're some kind of savior?" The words stung, but Isabella didn't flinch. She was done with the man who had abandoned her when she needed him most, the man who couldn't handle the truth, who had chosen to walk away because the child she carried wasn't his. She had been holding on to the idea of what their life could have been, but now she could see it for what it was, an illusion. "Daniel," Isabella said, her voice steady, her eyes meeting his for the first time since his return. "I'm not your wife anymore, not the way you want me to be." He blinked, taken aback by her words, as if he hadn't fully understood the gravity of their situation. His expression shifted, anger, hurt, confusion. The facade he had carefully built around his feelings cracked open, and for the first time Isabella saw a glimpse of the man she had married. "You don't mean that," he said, his voice tight. "You can't possibly think that what he's offering you is any better than what we had." Isabella swallowed, the lump in her throat thick and painful. She didn't want to hurt him, but the truth was undeniable now. Her heart no longer belonged to the life they had shared. It had shifted, and it had shifted to the man who had stepped in when she had nowhere else to turn. The man who had kept his promise to protect her and their daughter, even when it cost him everything. "No," Isabella replied, her voice gaining strength. "I don't mean what we had, because what we had wasn't real, Daniel. I wanted to believe it was. I wanted to believe you would be the father my child deserved, but I don't think you ever really understood what it meant to love someone, to fight for them. You were never ready for this." Daniel recoiled at her words, his face pale as the weight of her rejection settled over him. "You're saying I wasn't enough? That I didn't love you enough?" His voice wavered, but there was no denying the hurt in his eyes. "No," Isabella said, shaking her head. "What I'm saying is that I'm not the same person I was when I married you. I can't go back to that. Not when I know what I know now." Daniel's expression faltered, the last threads of hope he had clung to slipping through his fingers. "So you're choosing him? After everything he's done, you're choosing him over me?" "I'm choosing what's best for my daughter," Isabella said firmly. "I'm choosing safety, and I'm choosing loyalty. Ricardo has been here for me in ways you never were. He didn't walk away. He stayed. And now I need him to help me protect my child, and I need to protect her too." The silence in the room was deafening as the truth of Isabella's words hung between them. Daniel looked from her to Ricardo, his face twisting in disbelief. He couldn't reconcile what was happening in front of him. He couldn't understand why she had made this decision, why she had chosen the dangerous world of Mafia power over the safe, quiet life they had once planned together. "I don't understand," Daniel said, his voice breaking. "I thought I was enough for you. I thought we had a future, but now you're just throwing it all away." Isabella didn't know how to respond to the pain in his voice. She had loved him once, truly, but the man standing before her now was a stranger, someone who couldn't accept the reality of their situation, a man who had abandoned her when she needed him most. She couldn't go back to that. "I'm sorry, Daniel," she said softly, "but I've made my choice. I can't live in the past anymore." For a long moment, Daniel stood there, his chest rising and falling with each breath, his face a mixture of anger and hurt. Then, with a slow, defeated shake of his head, he turned and walked toward the door. "I don't know what to say to you anymore," he muttered under his breath, barely audible. "I thought I could fix this. I thought we could fix this." Isabella's heart broke for him, for the man who had been her whole world once, but she knew deep down she had made the right choice. She was no longer his. Not in the way he wanted. She wasn't his to fix. "Goodbye, Daniel," she whispered, the words more for herself than for him. The door clicked shut behind him with finality. Ricardo stepped forward, his expression unreadable, though his gaze softened slightly when he met her eyes. "You did what was necessary, Isabella," he said quietly. "You made the right choice." Isabella nodded, though the ache in her chest wouldn't go away. But it was the right choice. For her, for her daughter, and for the future they would now build together. As the silence settled in the room, Isabella finally allowed herself to exhale. The past was gone. What remained was the future, and it was one she would face alongside Ricardo, no matter the cost. The grand hall of the New England Aquarium was bathed in soft lighting, the glow of aquariums casting a serene, almost ethereal light on the guests gathered for the annual gala. Isabella stood by the grand entrance, her eyes scanning the room, taking in the elegance of the event, but her mind was miles away. She felt like an imposter in this glittering world, an outsider. The long, flowing emerald gown she wore clung to her pregnant form, its fabric shimmering under the soft lights. But despite the outward appearance of grace and poise, she was anything but composed on the inside. She could feel Ricardo's presence just behind her, a constant, grounding force. His eyes, sharp and calculating, were focused on the crowd, scanning for any signs of danger. His tall frame moved through the crowd with an air of command, as though the entire room were his domain. But beneath the exterior of the dangerous Mafia boss, Isabella could see the careful control in his every movement. He was never relaxed, never at ease, always watching, always ready for a fight. Tonight was their plan, their trap. The Morettis had been hunting her, using her pregnancy as leverage to control Ricardo. But now Ricardo was turning the tables. He had set the perfect trap, and Isabella, though reluctant, had agreed to play her part. The idea was simple: lure Agron Kresnicki, the head of the Moretti family, into the open. Use her as bait, make him think she was vulnerable, and then strike. Isabella's role was to pretend she was just a pregnant woman attending a gala, unaware of the danger lurking in the shadows. She would be the perfect target after all, pregnant, isolated, and with little knowledge of the threats that hung over her head. But the truth was, she wasn't as defenseless as she appeared, not anymore. "Stay close." Ricardo's voice broke through her thoughts, his words low and urgent. He stepped closer to her, his hand brushing against hers for a brief moment, a subtle reassurance. She looked up at him, meeting his eyes, the intensity of his gaze softening just slightly as he studied her face. "I'm ready," she said, though the words felt foreign to her. She was ready, yes, but what did that really mean? Ready to face the very people who had tried to destroy her life? Ready to take down the Morettis? Or was she simply ready to be a mother, to protect the life growing inside her, no matter the cost? The ballroom was filled with well-dressed guests, mingling, laughing, and enjoying the soft melodies of a string quartet that played in the background. But for Isabella, every conversation felt like noise. She couldn't focus on anything else except the looming sense of danger that hung in the air. She had to trust Ricardo, trust that he had a plan to protect her, to protect Sofia, their daughter, from whatever the Morettis might throw at them. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a low rumble in the distance. Ricardo's men were in position, their eyes sharp, their bodies tense, ready for the inevitable confrontation. They had already neutralized most of the Moretti operatives scattered throughout the gala. They had to. The moment Agron Kresnicki showed up, it would be too late. As if on cue, a group of men entered the room, and Isabella felt a cold shiver run down her spine. At the center of them was Agron Kresnicki, the leader of the Moretti family. His presence commanded the room in a way that only Mafia bosses could, calm, calculating, and dripping with arrogance. He was dressed in a sharp suit, his face unreadable, but Isabella could feel the tension radiating from him. His eyes scanned the crowd with precision, and for a moment they locked onto hers. The moment he laid eyes on her, Isabella's heart skipped a beat. This was it, the moment they had been preparing for. Agron was here. Ricardo stepped forward, his body blocking Isabella from view, his hand subtly brushing hers again, a silent promise of protection. "Stay calm," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Let's give them a show." Isabella felt her breath catch in her throat. A show. That's what this was. A game. And she had to play her part perfectly. Agron's eyes lingered on her for a moment longer, then shifted to Ricardo. He didn't speak immediately, but the air between them was thick with unspoken words. Isabella could feel the tension in the room. The Morettis had arrived, but they didn't know what Ricardo had planned for them. Ricardo's voice was steady as he addressed Agron. "You've been looking for her," he said, his words cutting through the tension like a knife. "But you found me first." Agron's lips curled into a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I didn't come for you, Ricardo. I came for her." His eyes flicked to Isabella, and she felt her stomach twist with unease. She was the bait, nothing more than a pawn in this deadly game. But Isabella wasn't afraid anymore. She had made her choice. She had chosen to stand with Ricardo, to trust him, and now, more than ever, she needed to prove she could hold her own. "Leave her out of this," Ricardo warned, his tone darkening. His hand was still subtly protecting Isabella, guiding her with his presence as they stood face to face with Agron and his men. "You don't get to decide that anymore," Agron sneered. "She's carrying what's mine. And you've been playing with fire, Ricardo. You've turned her into a weapon, and now I'm here to take her back." Before anyone could react, the standoff escalated. Ricardo's men, positioned all around the hall, closed in on Agron's group. Isabella's breath caught in her throat as she realized that Ricardo's plan had worked. Agron and his men were surrounded. There was nowhere for them to run. "Move!" Ricardo's voice barked, and in an instant, chaos erupted. Gunfire rang out, but it was controlled, precise. Ricardo's men didn't fire unless it was necessary, neutralizing the Moretti soldiers one by one. Isabella could hear the commotion in the distance, the clash of bodies, the sound of weapons, the chaos that had unfolded so quickly. But in the center of it all, she remained still, her heart pounding in her chest as she focused on Ricardo's every move. This was it. Agron's eyes darted around, realizing the trap he had fallen into. But it was too late. Ricardo's men had him cornered, and there was no way out. Isabella's role as bait had worked. Agron had walked right into it. He had underestimated Ricardo, underestimated how far he would go to protect her, to protect their child. As Agron's men were subdued, Ricardo stepped forward, his gun aimed directly at the Moretti leader. Agron raised his hands in mock surrender, but there was no trace of fear in his expression, only cold contempt. "This ends now," Ricardo said, his voice hard as steel. "You're done." Isabella watched, her breath steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Ricardo was in control, and she had played her part perfectly. The Moretti's grip on their operation was beginning to crumble. With a single nod from Ricardo, his men moved in to restrain Agron. He would be taken down, exposed, and the Moretti's empire would fall. But as Isabella watched the scene unfold before her, she couldn't help but feel a pang of uncertainty. She was forever tied to Ricardo now. The moment they had sealed this trap, her life had irrevocably changed. She was no longer just carrying his child. She was part of his world, the world of violence, control, and mafia wars. As Agron was escorted out, his face twisted in fury, Isabella realized the weight of her decision. She had chosen this life. There was no going back now, but as she looked up at Ricardo, his dark eyes meeting hers, she knew she had made the right choice, for her daughter, for their future. For better or worse, this was her life now. The air in the penthouse was thick with the weight of everything that had happened. The final pieces of the Moretti Empire had fallen into place, and Ricardo and Isabella stood in the eye of the storm, their future laid out before them like an open road. The bloodshed, the danger, the betrayals, it was all behind them now, but the scars would remain, each one a reminder of how far they had come and what they had lost along the way. Ricardo sat at the large, polished table in the center of the room, his posture as commanding as ever, but there was something different about him now. His gaze, usually cold and calculating, had softened over the past few months. There was a new light in his eyes, a light that had nothing to do with power or control. The small, delicate cry from the nursery made Isabella's heart swell. Sophia, their daughter, was awake. Ricardo was a father now, and the reality of that role was starting to take hold. No longer was he just the leader of a criminal empire. He was a man who had learned the true meaning of responsibility, of protection, of love. And as much as Isabella had once feared what his world would do to her, she had seen him transform in the ways she hadn't expected. "Isabella," Ricardo said, his voice calm, yet there was an unmistakable tenderness to it as he looked up at her. He gestured toward the door that led to their daughter's room. "She's calling for you." Isabella smiled softly, a genuine warmth filling her chest. She moved toward the door, her steps light despite the weight of her thoughts. When she reached Sophia's crib, She found her little girl stirring, her wide eyes blinking as she looked up at her mother. Isabella's heart melted as she reached down, lifting Sophia into her arms, feeling the small, warm body nestle against her chest. "Hey, little one," Isabella whispered, pressing a kiss to the top of Sophia's head. "It's just you and me, isn't it?" The baby cooed, her tiny hands grasping at Isabella's fingers as she was rocked gently in her mother's arms. Isabella's eyes fluttered closed for a moment, breathing in the scent of her daughter, sweet and innocent, so pure in the midst of all the chaos they had endured. She turned and walked back to the living area, Sophia cradled against her while Ricardo stood to his feet. He had a way of moving through the room, his presence undeniable, but it was different now. It wasn't just a force of power. It was the natural authority of a man who had found something worth protecting, something worth fighting for. He smiled as he saw Sophia in Isabella's arms, and for the first time, she saw something vulnerable, something human in his expression. The hard edges of his Mafia persona softened just slightly. "I never thought I'd be this happy," Ricardo said quietly, his voice filled with a quiet awe. "But here we are, our daughter, our family." Isabella couldn't help but smile as she met his gaze, her heart swelling in her chest. She had never expected to be here, standing beside him, holding their child in the home they had built together. This wasn't the life she had planned, but maybe it was the life she needed. "We've come a long way," Isabella said, her voice soft but filled with determination. "We've survived the worst, and now we have a chance to make it right." Ricardo nodded, his gaze never leaving her. "Yes, we do, and we'll make it count." It had been a week since the final battle against the Morettis. The police, armed with the evidence Isabella and Ricardo had gathered, had dismantled what was left of their criminal network. Agron Kresnicki, the man who had started it all, was behind bars, awaiting trial. The Morettis were no longer a threat to them or to Sophia, but there was still one final piece of the puzzle left to resolve. The past that Isabella had tried so hard to leave behind. Daniel. She had put it off long enough, but today was the day she would confront him one last time. As she sat across from Ricardo at the table, a silence stretched between them. Ricardo's eyes were steady, understanding, but he didn't speak. This was Isabella's fight, her final step in moving forward. "I'm going to meet him," Isabella said, her voice firm. Ricardo looked at her, his brow furrowing slightly. "Are you sure?" She nodded, her gaze unwavering. "I need to do this, for myself, for Sophia." She paused, her fingers lightly tapping the edge of her coffee cup. "I need to let go of everything I was holding on to. I need to make peace with the past." Ricardo sat back in his chair, his expression unreadable, but his gaze softened as he reached across the table and gently touched her hand. "You don't need to do this alone, Isabella. I'm here." Isabella squeezed his hand, grateful for his support. They had come a long way, and now it was time to finally close the door on the life she had once known. Daniel had agreed to meet at a small cafe in the city. A neutral ground. When Isabella arrived, she found him already seated at a corner table, his posture slouched, his face weary. His eyes darted to her as she approached, and for a moment, he looked as though he might say something, but then he fell silent. She sat across from him, her heart racing. This was the man she had once loved, the man she had trusted with her life. But that version of him was gone, replaced by a man who couldn't accept the reality of the situation, a man who had abandoned her when she needed him the most. "Isabella," Daniel said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. I didn't think I'd see you again, not like this." She didn't respond immediately, letting the silence linger as she studied him. There was a time when she would have crumbled at the sight of him, when his gaze would have been enough to pull her back into his orbit. But now, everything was different. "I came here to finally end this," she said, her voice steady but filled with a quiet resolve. "To make peace with the past, with everything that happened between us." Daniel looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and longing. I never wanted it to end like this, Isabella. I never wanted to hurt you, but I couldn't. I couldn't raise another man's child. I couldn't live with that. Isabella's heart twisted in her chest, but she didn't let it show. You don't get to make that decision for me anymore, Daniel. I'm not yours to control. I'm not the woman you thought I was. His gaze faltered, the pain in from his eyes unmistakable. I know I failed you. I didn't stand by you when you needed me, but I can't help but feel that if you gave me a chance, we could have worked things out. We could raise Sophia together. I could be the father she deserves. Isabella swallowed the lump in her throat, the hurt of their past rushing back. You're not the father she deserves, Daniel. You weren't ready for this. You didn't even fight for us when it mattered. The silence between them was suffocating as the weight of her words settled in. Finally, Isabella spoke again, her voice calm and final. I've moved on, Daniel. I'm with Ricardo now. He's the one who's here for me. He's the one who's protecting our daughter, and I need to let go of everything I thought we could have. Daniel's face crumpled, and for a moment Isabella thought he might break down in front of her, but he didn't. He stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, and looked at her one last time. I hope you find what you're looking for, he said, his voice hoarse. I'll always care about you, Isabella, but I can't be part of this life, not anymore. With that, he turned and walked out of the cafe, leaving her with nothing but the sound of his retreating footsteps. Isabella stood at the window of their penthouse, Sophia cradled in her arms, Ricardo beside her. They had made it through the storm, and now they were building something new, a family. Are you ready? Ricardo asked, his voice filled with quiet anticipation. Isabella smiled, feeling the weight of everything she had fought for. Yes, she said softly, I'm ready. The wedding was small, private, just the way they had both wanted. It wasn't the grand event she had once imagined, but it was everything she needed. Ricardo stood beside her, Sophia nestled in his arms, a family finally united in a world they had built together, despite the odds. As Ricardo placed the ring on her finger, Isabella looked up at him, seeing him not just as the Mafia boss, but as the man who had loved her through it all. She had fought for this life, and now she was finally home. The world they had fought to create was theirs, together. Wow, you made it all the way here. That means you care about stories like this. So don't miss the next one. Go ahead, click it. It's waiting for you.